The crystal stem slipped from Clara's hand before she even registered the force behind it. It hit the walnut table with a sharp crack, fragments of glass, skipping across the linen like broken promises. A shallow cut flared red across her palm, but the pain didn't register. Not over the roar in her ears. Not over the ochre envelope tossed carelessly in front of her plate, like a discarded napkin. Silence fell thick and suffocating. 24 eyes turned toward her, most gleaming, with poorly disguised interest, some even curling into smirks. At the head of the table, her husband Martin's voice came down cold and emotionless. "They're divorce papers." Clara's throat tightened. She blinked once. "Excuse me." Martin didn't flinch. "I thought it would be better to do this with everyone present." It wasn't just the words. It was the ease, the dismissiveness, as if ending their 8-year marriage was as casual as asking someone to pass the rolls. From the far end, Agnes, the family matriarch and Clara's mother-in-law, set her wineglass down with deliberate grace. We felt it would be gentler this way. She said, her tone dipped in condescension. Gentler for who Clara managed, voice low tight. Her fingers curled over the envelope, its weight suddenly unbearable. A cruel little chuckle came from Justine Martin's sister, whose perfect curls and perfect sneer had always arrived ahead of her at every family gathering. "I mean, really," she drawled, "that little shack behind the house, your studio, it's just an excuse not to get a real job." Laughter rippled around the table. Even the cousins people Clara had once thought might be kind allowed themselves small, bitter smiles. She looked to Martin, her husband, the man who once stayed up all night, to hang her first amateur exhibit. Now he stared blankly at his plate, a stranger in a custom suit. "You've filed for divorce," she repeated slowly at Thanksgiving dinner. "Martin will be moving back into the guest quarters," Agnes announced, picking at her cranberry salad, like a monarch declaring war. "This house needs someone more grounded." Clara felt her heart splinter, but she did not break. Beneath the white cloth draping the table, her left hand moved instinctively to her purse fingertips, brushing something solid, a folded document sharp-edged and waiting. The deed. The one Martin had signed after too much whiskey on their anniversary last year, naming her the sole owner of the estate. He hadn't remembered the next morning, and she had never reminded him. She stood, slowly, deliberately. "You're right," she said, blood from her cut beginning to seep into the pristine napkin clenched in her hand. "I don't belong here." Clara Martin started uncertain now. "No," she cut in, voice calm, deadly. "I am far above this." Around the table, silverware stilled midair. Even the smug faces lost their surety. Lena Clara turned to her best friend seated beside her, the only reason she hadn't bailed on this dinner from the start. "Would you mind taking me to urgent care?" "Of course," Lena said, already rising. Clara took a final look at the table, at Agnes with her wine, at Justine with her smirk, at Martin with his shame. And Agnes Clara added, walking past the stunned assembly, "You'll want to soak that tablecloth tonight. Blood sets fast, kind of like legal deeds." Gasps filled the air. She didn't stop. Out in the cold night, Lena helped her into the car. Her hand throbbed, but her mind was razor sharp. Clara wasn't leaving in defeat. She was stepping into something new. And this time, it would be on her terms. The gears had turned. The plan she'd once kept in shadows now stood in full daylight. And as they drove away from the Harrington estate, Clara whispered the words she'd been too afraid to say out loud for years. It's time. The morning after Thanksgiving, the air was brittle and silent, the kind that carried a warning. Clara sat at the edge of Lena's kitchen table, one hand bandaged, and the other curled around a mug of lukewarm coffee. Her phone screen glowed with the reply from her attorney. Confirmed. Deed is legally valid. Let's move. Clara didn't hesitate. Do it. She typed her thumbs steady her pulse louder than ever. Then she looked at Lena, whose eyes never left hers. Are you sure? Lena asked gently, setting down her own coffee. This is a lot. Clara exhaled. I've been sure for a year. Just didn't realize how ready I was until last night. By noon, Gloria, her attorney, arrived with a navy blue folder thick with paperwork. She didn't offer sympathy, only precision. We'll file the deed today and submit an eviction notice by certified delivery to the Harrington estate. Clara nodded once. Let's make it formal. The municipal building was quiet, nearly empty thanks to the holiday weekend. Clara walked up the steps alone, the sound of her boots echoing against stone columns like a drumbeat. The clerk barely looked up as she filed the property documents. But when Clara signed the final page, she felt something shift inside her. A cord snapped, a tether cut. She was no longer tied to the Harrington name, only to the land beneath her heels. That evening she returned to the estate, not in secret, not in shame. The gates groaned as she entered, headlights sweeping across the grand stone facade like a stage light before the first act. Clara wore a long black coat, her hair pulled back tight, and in her hand a leather-bound folder containing the eviction notice, the deed, and a simple cover letter titled Ownership Confirmation, 118 Willow Grove Lane. She rang the bell. Once. Martin answered. His face shifted confusion, then something darker. Clara. It's not a social visit, she said, holding the papers between them. It's legal. Behind him, the warmth of the old house, flickered fireplaces, chandeliers, Agnes's signature floral arrangements. She could almost hear the echoes of last night's laughter directed at her. I need to speak with everyone, Clara said calmly. Martin stepped aside instinctively, perhaps, or maybe because even he knew something had changed. The family was gathered in the living room. Agnes perched on her cream velvet armchair, her expression a carefully crafted mask. Justin leaned against the marble mantel arms, folded lips curled. Clara stepped into the center, her boots clicking against the polished floor. I'm here to inform you that this property, she said, pulling out the final document, has legally been under my name for nearly a year. The room went quiet. Agnes blinked. What nonsense, signed by Martin, notarized, filed, and now enforced. Clara cut in, her voice steady. She handed her mother-in-law the notice. You have 30 days to vacate. Justine scoffed, stepping forward. This is insane. You can't just throw us out of our own home. Clara met her gaze. It's not your home. Martin sat down hard on the edge of the coffee table, rubbing his temples. I'm not here to argue, Clara continued. I'm not here for revenge. But if you thought you could discard me and keep living here like nothing happened, you were wrong. Agnes's mouth tightened. She scanned the document like it might dissolve if she stared hard enough. But the truth was right there, stamped and binding. Clara turned to leave. No dramatics. No last words. The message had landed. At the door she paused and looked back once, not at Martin or Agnes, but at the grand chandelier above them, a piece she'd once lovingly dusted every Sunday, while they criticized her brushwork. It sparkled above their stunned silence. As she stepped out into the night, the first snow began to fall soft and quiet. She walked toward the future, with her boots crunching against the gravel. leaving behind a legacy of cruelty that no longer had any hold over her. The first crack had formed, and the house was beginning to tremble. The morning sun broke through the frost-smeared windows of Lena's apartment, casting pale gold patterns across Clara's sketchbook. She sat on the living room floor legs, folded beneath her pen, moving with the kind of urgency that only clarity could ignite. What once felt like a fantasy tucked in the corners of her mind was now spilling onto the page room by room, brick by brick. She drew not walls, but windows wide and tall, not dining rooms, but studios filled with easels' natural light and space to breathe. She didn't want a home. She wanted the haven. Lena peeked over her shoulder. "This looks huge." "It is," Clara said simply. "It has to be. The grand Harrington estate, 3 stories of tradition ornament and performance, would become a place where no one's art was laughed at, where no one was told to get a real job. It would no longer host pretentious dinners or quiet humiliation. It would live again, this time filled with creation, not judgment. By noon, she picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in months. Professor Bennett speaking. Professor Clara said, surprised at how firm her voice sounded. "It's me. Clara Monroe." A pause. Then Clara. "The prodigal brush returns. What's awakened you?" "I'm ready," she said. "I've got a space. And a vision." She heard a rustle papers, maybe a stool being shifted. "I'm listening." Over the next 20 minutes, she outlined her plan. The Haven would be more than just a gallery. It would have a restoration studio workshops for emerging artists, and space for those whose work had been cast aside, not because it lacked value, but because someone told them it wasn't enough. "I want it to be open access," she explained. "Transparent processes. Community involvement. No gatekeeping." When she finished, there was silence on the line. Then Bennett let out a low whistle. "Damn, Clara. You're not painting anymore. You're building." She smiled. "Exactly. I've still got my studio in South Boston," he said. "You come by Monday. Bring your sketches. I've got a few things contact suppliers, maybe even a contractor who won't flinch at a crumbling wine cellar." Clara hung up and stared at the ceiling. Her heart pounded not from nerves, but from the adrenaline of finally moving. 2 days later, they stood in the Harrington estate foyer, her Lena and Professor Bennett. Dust floated in shafts of afternoon light, like tiny ghosts of the past. Bennett stepped through the rooms, slowly rubbing his jaw, nodding. "It's solid, a little too polished, but the bones, they're good." Clara unrolled her blueprint across the old oak dining table, the same one where she had been handed her walking papers. Now it was the launch pad. "This will be the main gallery," she said, pointing. "We'll knock out this wall for light, convert the study into a restoration lab. Upstairs, guest rooms become artist-in-residence suites." Lena, who had quietly stayed back, finally stepped forward. "You know what I love about this?" she asked, voice soft. "You're not erasing what happened here. You're transforming it." Clara nodded. "It's not about revenge. I don't care if they think they won. I care that I can give something beautiful to people who've been silenced." Outside, the wind shook the bare branches against the window pane. Inside, Clara traced the edge of the table with her fingertips. "It's strange," she said. "This house was once a prison." Professor Bennett grinned. "Now it's a canvas." She met his gaze. "Let's start painting." The first hammer swing echoed through the estate, like a bell tolling the end of an era. Dust rained down as outdated wallpaper peeled in long, brittle strips. Ornate chandeliers were gently lowered and packed away. The heavy armchairs, Agnes's beloved French heritage pieces, were carried out like relics of a monarchy finally crumbling. Clara stood at the center of it all, blueprint in hand, hard hat slightly askew. That wall goes. We open this archway. Light comes through here. The crew nodded, moving like clockwork. Her vision was becoming reality, inch by inch. By the 5th day, the local arts blog had published a teaser article, Widow Reclaims Historic Mansion, to build artist sanctuary. Photos of Clara's sleeves, rolled-up boots covered in plaster, circulated alongside shots of the estate's crumbling interiors. The piece exploded on social media. On the 10th day, a Chicago-based art collector offered to fund the gallery wing. On the 12th, Clara's inbox lit up with a message she read 3 times just to believe it. The Smithsonian Conservation Center is requesting a meeting to discuss your open access restoration model. Please advise availability. She sat in the middle of the gutted living room phone in one hand, a rolled sketch of the exhibition hall in the other, stunned into silence. She had dreamed of working with them years ago, applied 3 times, rejected 3 times. Now they were coming to her. But with every inch of progress came the inevitable resistance. On the morning of the 13th day, Marcus, the newly hired security guard, radioed from the front gate. "Miss Monroe, there's a Mr. Martin Harrington here. Says it's urgent." Clara didn't flinch. Let him into the garden, not beyond. 5 minutes later, she stepped onto the porch, boots crunching against loose gravel. Martin stood awkwardly near the rosebush's hands, deep in his coat pockets, eyes rimmed red. "Thanks for seeing me," he said, voice lower than usual. "You've got 5 minutes," Clara replied. "Justine's pregnant," he blurted. "She's due in the spring." Clara folded her arms. "And that concerns me how. We were going to ask if look this house. It's part of our family. 4 generations. Our child should be born here." Clara's laugh was short, dry. "In the house, where your sister once mocked my work, where your mother called me an embarrassment at the table." Martin's mouth moved, but no words came. She pulled out a copy of the fully approved floor plan, city seal gleaming at the top. "This property is being converted into a public arts center, legally permitted, financially backed. Groundbreaking's already begun. There's nothing for you here." His hands shook slightly as he took the papers, flipping through them without really reading. "My mother won't agree to this." Clara tilted her head. "Your mother no longer has a say." That afternoon her phone rang again. Unknown number. "Ella Monroe," she answered. "I'm requesting a meeting immediately," said the clipped, unmistakable voice of Agnes Harrington. Clara didn't hesitate. "I'm not legally obligated to meet you, Mrs. Harrington. You don't understand the consequences," Agnes snapped. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Clara said calmly. "I'm not dismantling tradition. I'm building something new." She hung up without waiting for a reply. The next morning, security cameras caught Agnes at the gate, dressed in black cashmere, gesturing furiously at Marcus. "I'm sorry," he said, voice firm. "Miss Monroe doesn't take unscheduled visitors." Later that evening, an email arrived from the Harrington family's legal counsel. The offer was straightforward, double the estate's market value, in exchange for Clara's silence and withdrawal. She read it once, then typed her reply. "I'm not interested in money. I'm interested in purpose." And as she leaned back in her chair, surrounded by the bones of a home being reborn, she smiled. Let them rage, let them send lawyers, and plead for legacy. The walls were talking now, and for the first time they were telling her story. The gate intercom crackled again. Same sharp voice. Same attempt at command masked as courtesy. "Clara, we need to speak." Clara stood inside the main foyer, surrounded by scaffolding and buckets of primer. She could see Agnes on the monitor, immaculate as ever, dressed like she'd stepped out of a luxury catalog, fingers tapping against the metal box, like it owed her an apology. "No meetings," Clara said into the intercom. "Submit your concerns through counsel." Agnes recoiled as if slapped. "You think this is over? You think a few permits and a crew of hacks makes you queen of the estate?" Clara didn't answer. She just reached forward and clicked the screen off. That same afternoon, her lawyer forwarded a new message from the Harringtons' legal team. The subject line read, "Final offer confidential settlement." Inside was a figure double the appraised value of the house, and a proposed NDA clause that would prevent Clara from ever discussing the Thanksgiving incident or the family's behavior publicly. Clara stared at it for a moment, then typed, "I'm not interested in money. I'm interested in purpose." She hit send. Lena, painting trim in the hallway, leaned around the corner. Was that another bribe? Clara nodded, tossing her phone onto the nearby workbench. "Third this week. Remind me again why you don't want to print that email and frame it." Clara smiled faintly. "Tempting. But I have better things to hang on these walls." The next morning her inbox pinged again. This time it was a formal summons. Agnes was requesting mediation. She claimed the renovations were harming the family's legacy, the emotional well-being of future generations, and violated the intended spirit of property use. Gloria. Her attorney laughed out loud reading it. "Well, this is a stretch," she said, flipping through the pages. "They're trying to argue that your legally acquired property is spiritually misaligned." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Is that even a thing in court? Barely. In the press, sure. But I don't think you need to worry." Still, the harassment escalated. Unfounded reports were sent to the city's zoning office. Clara's permit approvals were re-reviewed. A freelance journalist emailed her asking for comment on rumors that she was destroying a historic cultural landmark. Clara sat at her desk that night, fingers drumming against her cup of tea. The windows rattled softly from wind outside, and for a second she felt the house breathing with her. This place, for all its past cruelty, was a living thing now. It had stories in its walls, and they weren't about grandeur or legacy. They were about survival, and Clara intended to protect them. The following week, the local news finally caught up with the real story. A segment aired featuring footage of the house's transformation. Reporters toured the studio space. Former art students, current collaborators, even Professor Bennett were interviewed. "She's not destroying tradition," he said on camera, standing beside Clara outside the gallery in progress. "She's reinterpreting it. This estate won't be a tomb for old names. It'll be a birthplace for new ones." That night, Clara sat alone in what used to be the Harringtons' prized drawing room, now stripped of furniture and gloss. The bare wood floor reflected the moonlight in slivers. She looked down at her paint-stained hands and whispered to the silence, "You're almost free," because the ghosts still lingered in the halls, in the echoes in the strained phone calls and fruitless legal threats. But the gates, they were hers now, and not even the most powerful woman in the city could force them open again. The air shimmered with golden light as evening settled over the haven. Warm lamps lined the walkway from the gate to the gallery doors, and the restored brick facade glowed like something reborn. A low murmur of anticipation carried from the front steps all the way inside. where Clara stood behind a velvet curtain, fingers wrapped around a glass of water heart, steady but loud. Guests trickled in, curators, collectors, art students, neighbors, and even strangers drawn by the buzz. They paused in the grand entry hall, once the Harringtons' hallowed space of judgment, now washed in soft amber tones, and lined with paintings that whispered stories of struggle and triumph. Lena approached her emerald dress, catching the light. "You have to see the line outside," she whispered, eyes wide. "It wraps around the block. Channel 6 is filming by the stairs." Clara gave a small nod, her voice calm. "Let them in." A chime rang through the space, and the crowd quieted. The docent stepped forward, welcomed the attendees, and introduced the evening's presentation. At exactly 8 Sauzewund, Clara stepped from behind the curtain to the low hum of camera shutters and hushed admiration. She walked to the podium, sat in front of a large covered frame. "Thank you for being here," she began, voice steady. "This house was once a place of silence, a place where art was dismissed. Dreams were mocked, and I was told to shrink in order to fit. But tonight, it belongs to voices like mine." She turned slightly toward the draped painting behind her. "This piece was born from betrayal, but it was completed with conviction. I call it reclamation, not just of property, but of self." With a nod, 2 assistants pulled the cloth away. Gasps echoed through the room. The massive canvas glimmered under the spotlights. Oil paint shattered crystal fragments of newspaper clippings, even scorched lace from an old table runner. At the center stood a flipped dining table, its legs like fractured limbs. Around it, shards reflected dozens of faces frozen in expressions of scorn, discomfort, laughter. And in the middle, tall and composed, a woman with a paintbrush in hand, her gaze piercing and forward. Silence. Then applause. It began as a ripple, then rose like a wave crashing over the crowd. But just as Clara stepped back, the front doors creaked open. Mildred Harrington entered, poised, perfect. Her heels clicked against the gallery floor as the room hushed again. Behind her trailed Martin and Justine, the latter visibly pregnant, her expression unreadable. Mildred's voice carried with the same icy edge it always had. "I thought this was a public gallery." Clara met her gaze. "It is. Everyone's welcome." "You've used our name, our house, to stage a scandal," Mildred said, chin high. "You've disgraced our legacy." "I didn't disgrace anything," Clara replied, still calm. "I told the truth, through art." She gestured toward the painting. "This is what happened, and for the first time, people are listening." Mildred opened her mouth to retort, but another burst of applause rose this time, directed at Clara. From the back of the room, a silver-haired man stepped forward. "The lead curator of the New England Museum of Fine Arts, Mrs. Monroe," he said loud enough for all to hear. "We're considering reclamation for our next exhibit, Women and the Voice." "It's extraordinary." Mildred's mouth snapped shut. Justine's eyes dropped. Martin simply stepped back. Clara said nothing more. She turned to Lena, lifted her glass, and whispered to the words that once broke me now, the foundation of something greater. Behind them, the painting caught the light again. Glass once shattered now shimmered like stars. It was a cold Monday morning when Clara's phone buzzed on her studio desk. She barely glanced up from the frame. She was repairing an 18th century piece with silver leaf damage until she saw Lena's name and the trembling urgency in her voice. "Clara, turn on Channel 9. Now." Clara set down her tools, wiped her hands, and grabbed the remote. The screen flared to life just in time to catch the red banner scrolling across the bottom. Breaking Harrington Capital. Under federal investigation. Millions unaccounted for. The anchor's voice was grave. Sources confirm that Mildred Harrington and her son Martin Harrington are under scrutiny for alleged financial misconduct, including misuse of client funds and leveraging properties, one of which is the estate formerly located at 118 Willow Grove Lane. Clara's heart thudded once hard. She didn't feel joy, just a cold, unsettling clarity, had she not filed the deed when she did. Everything she built, the gallery, the haven, her new life might have vanished overnight, seized as collateral in a storm she didn't start. Her phone rang again. This time it was Gloria. "You're clear," she said without greeting. "Good thing you filed early. That house would have been frozen under federal investigation." Clara closed her eyes. "How bad is it?" "Very. Martin's already cooperating. Throwing Mildred under the bus, it seems." "Of course he is." That night, as Clara applied the final sealant to the restored frame, her phone lit up with a number she hadn't seen in weeks. "Julie." Clara hesitated, then answered. A shallow breath. Then Julie's voice barely holding together. "I have nowhere else to go." Clara didn't reply. Julie continued. "Brandon's cut me off. Mom's been subpoenaed. I'm 8 months along. I'm staying in a motel off Route 2. No money, no car, no one." The words felt surreal coming from the woman who once sneered at Clara's work, who had laughed at her studio and called it a hobby shack. "I know. I don't deserve anything from you," Julie whispered. "But please, not for me, for the baby. Just until I figure something out." Clara looked around her studio, warm, clean, filled with soft lamplight and quiet creation. She looked down at her paint-stained palms, the same hands that once trembled over divorce papers at that cursed Thanksgiving table. They no longer trembled. They had built something real. "The guest house behind the gallery is empty," Clara said at last. "I'll reset the code. You can stay until the baby comes. Then we reassess." Julie let out a sob, a mix of shame and relief. 3 hours later, a silver sedan pulled up quietly to the haven's gate. Julie stepped out, visibly thinner hair, pulled into a loose knot clothes, stretched over her round belly. She carried a canvas duffel worn and fraying. Gone were the designer boots. Gone was the perfume. "Thank you," she said softly, eyes red. "I don't deserve this." Clara led her through the garden path to the guest cottage. Clean sheets, warm lights, water already running. "I'm not doing this for you," Clara said gently, pausing at the door. "I'm doing it for the child. He didn't choose any of this. And because I believe no one should be forever defined by their worst moment." Julie nodded, tears streaming silently. Clara turned without another word and walked back to the main house. Later that night, she stood before reclamation. Her masterwork now hung permanently in the front gallery. The glass still caught the light, like slivers of memory. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't weakness. It was freedom. It was letting go of what no longer served her and choosing to build something better, even for the ones who tried to break her. Spring came quietly to the haven. The once rigid lawn now danced with wild lavender and soft white daisies, planted by local students who'd taken ownership of the garden with an artist's care. The brick walls, once cold and imposing, now bore splashes of murals, in progress stories told in color, grief reshaped in light. Inside the halls, buzzed not with whispers or judgment, but with laughter, footsteps, and the gentle scratch of charcoal on canvas. Every room breathed purpose. Clara stood by the upstairs window of her office watching a small group of teens gather in the courtyard for an outdoor workshop. Their teacher, one of Bennett's former students, was explaining brush pressure using the metaphor of wind on water. She turned as a soft knock tapped on her door. Marcus, the security guard, peeked in. "There's a visitor at the gate," he said, his voice unusually careful. "Says her name is Mildred Harrington." Clara blinked once. "She's alone. Cars parked a block down. No entourage. No appointment. Just standing there, holding something wrapped in cloth." Clara exhaled, nodding. Let her in. But only to the reception hall. A few minutes later, the front door opened with a quiet creak. Clara descended the staircase slowly, every step deliberate. In the center of the sunlit reception space stood Mildred, her posture straighter than age allowed, but her face was changed. No mask of pride, no smug tilt to the chin, just a woman weathered by consequence. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she gently set the bundle on the table and unwrapped it. Inside was a faded portrait of a young woman with soft curls and an almost haunted gaze. "This was my mother," she said, her voice soft. "It's been in the attic for decades. I forgot it was even there." Clara approached slowly, eyes scanning the fine cracks across the paint, the delicate lines fraying at the corners. "I know I wronged you," Mildred said suddenly. "Dismissed your work, mocked your dreams, treated you like you didn't belong. And when everything fell apart..." She looked up, eyes glistening. "This was the only piece of the past I could still carry." Clara sat across from her. "I can restore it," she said quietly, tracing the frame. "But it won't ever look the way it did before." Mildred frowned slightly. Clara continued, "And that's a good thing. The cracks tell the truth. Restoration doesn't erase what happened. It honors it." There was a long pause. Then Mildred reached into her coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. A typed note, simple signed. "I'd like to work here," she said. "Cleaning, cataloging, even just making tea. I need to do something real. Not to undo the past, but to finally live with it." Clara looked at her for a long moment, then reached behind the desk and pulled out a volunteer intake form. "Start Monday," she said. Mildred let out a breath barely audible, but it sounded like surrender. In the weeks that followed, she arrived each morning in plain clothes, and no makeup, carrying a notebook, and questions instead of orders. She filed artwork, cleaned brushes, and once spent an entire afternoon sitting quietly in front of students' sketches, just watching. Julie now, a mother to a peaceful baby boy named Isaac, had moved into the guest house full-time. She enrolled in a local course on antique restoration and could often be seen in the lab beside Professor Bennett, her brow furrowed in concentration. Clara would sometimes catch them both laughing. One breezy evening, Clara walked the garden alone, the sun dropping gold over the roof lines. Inside, light spilled through stained glass onto gallery floors. She paused by her favorite window hand, pressed against the frame. She thought about everything, the humiliation, the rage, the grief. And then, about reclamation, the art, the classes, the forgiveness. She had once been painted into a corner. Now she'd painted her way out. And standing inside this house-turned haven, she finally understood dignity once reclaimed is indestructible.